My friends, we've been talking about Matthew chapter 18 and Jesus' instructions regarding what to do if things get weird in a relationship, if somebody, quote, sins against you, or if there is destructive sin within the new family of faith within the church. And you probably remember this, but I just want to read it again right now. Matthew 18, 15 through 17, very practical. This is Jesus talking about how to get this stuff straightened out when it goes wrong. Here's what he says. Verse 15, if your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you've won them over. But if they won't listen, take one or two others along so that, quote, every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. This is a very important, very straightforward, and also very difficult to get right passage. And my guess is that the vast majority of you who've been in on this conversation with me for the last couple of days can think of a time or two when maybe this hasn't gone perfectly. Maybe you can even think of a time or two where it didn't go perfectly and you bear some of the blame for that. You, my friends, will get no judgment from me, but I do want to carefully think through what this thing is, because I think doing so gets us to a place of having soft hearts, gets us to a place where maybe we can even think of what we need to do with the stuff that's gone wrong relationally in the past and think about how to get things right in future situations that are a little bit sideways as well. I'm going to have Jeff play some music and we'll pick it up where we left off right there. The simple version of this passage is as follows. Jesus just spent the last chapter plus explaining to his guys that he's going to die at the hands of the religious leaders, that he's going to be raised, and that he's going to ascend. He's communicated, I'm not going to be with you forever. They grieved, they bargained, they got angry. Finally, they reached acceptance toward the end of 17. And so we're on to the reality that everyone's accepting who's in Jesus' inner circle. He's moving on. He's going to be in a different place. He isn't going to be physically with his church the way he's been physically with the disciples, which leaves this important question that the disciples wrongly ask at the beginning of chapter 18. That is, well, who then is going to be the greatest? Who will carry the mantle? Who will be in charge to keep things from getting weird? And Jesus then expands into this artfully crafted series of thoughts that answer the question in light of how valuable this church, this new family of faith is. And all of that moves us to this place where he's saying, I am not going to be physically there with you the way I have been, but here's what you're going to need to work things out when they get sideways. If something goes wrong, go alone and in private and try to work it out between the two parties that see it. If that doesn't get it done, take 2 or 3 witnesses, make sure you have your facts straight and try that. If that doesn't get it done, and this sin thing, this destructive thing is still going on, then I am with you even if you're in the minority as you deal with this very difficult thing in front of the whole church. The only thing I can read as optional about this plan of attack is to see a slight against oneself, choose to give the other person the benefit of the doubt and let it go, and move on in grace and peace, assuming the other person was just off or had a bad day or that you misunderstood or that you're being too sensitive. Otherwise, if you are going to address something, this is how you have to address something in the kingdom. I know, once again, that some of you are listening who would say, but you don't always. I can think of a time that you let me down, like you, Matt, the person doing the podcast. You were in this position and you didn't get it right. Yep, probably that is accurate. I've never tried to get something wrong while I was in the middle of it, but looking back, sometimes I suspect that I did not get all the things right as much as I would have liked to have gotten all the things right, and as much as decisions I made and how to do this thing felt like they were in keeping with this at the time. The point is, it's hard. This stuff is sticky. This stuff is difficult. And I do not bring up this passage and say, hey, everybody, because I know what I'm doing and always get my interpersonal relationship stuff right. And I bought a microphone and I made a podcast in my basement. Now, when I read this passage to you, you have to follow my example because I am so well behaved and I'm a wonderful spiritual example for everyone on the internet. I don't think that for a second. That is miles from what I think about myself. What I do think is that the text says what it says, and the dude who initiated the church, who initiated a religion that bears his name, said, this is how Christians work things out with each other when stuff gets sideways. Not sometimes, every single time. This is it. And implicit in what he says in the passages we're going to look at next time around is that he knows that this is going to be incredibly difficult at times, that he understands the sleepless nights and the difficulty and the pain that one will feel when they try to do this thing the right way, and he's with us and he's got our back even when we have to work through this difficult stuff without him physically in our presence as he was giving these instructions to the disciples. And I suppose I do need to comment on this last little line, treat him as you would a pagan or a tax collector. It's a little bit tongue-in-cheek because Jesus treats pagans and tax collectors like people to grab a meal with and to invite to be a part of his kingdom. But also, that's a little bit not tongue-in-cheek because what he's saying is you treat them like the lost. Pagan or tax collector in Jesus' world, in Jesus' mentality, doesn't mean you hate them and despise them and treat them as people who are pure evil, rotten to the core, no longer redeemable in any way, and totally anathema. Instead, to treat them as a pagan and a tax collector like Jesus did is to treat them like they're not a part of the family of faith and like they're people who are in need of understanding what the family of faith is, what the kingdom is, who the king is, and people who should be invited to that family of faith as if they'd never been a part before. So this is not a complete rejection of someone as a human if they won't even listen to the church. The instruction here, the commissioning here would seem to be treat anyone who goes all the way through all three phases of this and is ultimately in a state of refusal to listen even to the church, treat them as objects of empathy and compassion and care. That doesn't mean that now you get to trash them or destroy them or sit back and finally exhale and be like, oh, thank goodness so-and-so's gone. Now things can get back to better. Oh, there should be heartbreak over this, and there should be an immediate, earnest desire to invite that person who went through the process and didn't listen to the church right back in, but as a person who's lost and apparently has not understood what the kingdom and the values of the king are about. Some good, smart people might look at that and say, no, I think it is just slang for completely reject them. And once somebody has tasted of the kingdom and then rejected it in the manner described in this passage, they're just out. I don't know. Could be, but I'm more sold on that first explanation I gave and what Jesus' attitude was toward exactly these kind of lost people. This stuff really does cut to the heart of who we are. I think for most of us, when we think about the things that we wish had gone differently in our lives, there's probably a decision here or there that we made, just something foolish or destructive that we wish we could undo. But probably most of the deepest regrets that we have to do with things that Jesus is addressing right here. Broken relationships, damaged people, ourselves being damaged people, whether we were on the giving end or the receiving end of the slight of what went wrong, whether we were on the giving end or the receiving end of this thing not being handled quite right when it was our turn to have our problems addressed, whatever it is, I think all of us have got some lingering wreckage that we drag around behind us. And so I'd like to do something I don't normally do on this podcast, and that is propose a couple of courses of action beyond the text. You can take or leave this. I could make a Bible case for this, but this time around, I'm just throwing out an opinion, a thought here to close out our day. One, I think it's a really good idea, whether you're a person who would say they're a Christian or not, to redouble your intellectual commitment to this course of action when things go sideways relationally. And two, it might be worth our time to pick up a phone and call that person or stop by and see that person with whom things are broken. You will sleep better if you do. You will feel a peace about it if you do. There's something very liberating about asking for forgiveness. There's something very liberating about seeking resolution, whether you actually get it or not. Maybe it's not the time. Maybe the circumstances just simply don't allow it as you think back on your situations. But broken relationships that didn't necessarily have to be broken relationships that could be resolved, those tend to be the kind of thing that it's easy to put off till tomorrow or the next day or forever. And then at some point, I think most of us make this tacit decision to say, yeah, I'm not going to resolve that in this lifetime. I'm just not gonna. I think it might feel better, and I think it might be right if we did. I'm going to think about what that looks like on my end. It might be life-giving for you to think about what that might look like on your end. Again, these are just thoughts and opinions as I process through what is an incredibly clear and concise and simply put passage that is very difficult to execute and that is very difficult to compare my track record with, and I suspect maybe your track record with, as we look back on all the good, bad, and ugly of our relationships along the way. If Jesus doesn't address this topic, if he doesn't leave us with a passage like this at some point, it means I don't think he ever really cared about his church. But he knows how we are. He knows these things are going to get weird. He knows we don't like confrontation. He knows we don't know what to do when we're off balance like this. And he knows that a really quick way to destroy relationships and even to put us in a place where we do bad, destructive things is to have us be in a situation like this where we can't figure out how to resolve a broken thing because of guilt and shame and a feeling of being slighted. And then if that spirals on, things really can break in very big ways. The fact that he loves his church, that he means all that stuff he said about the vulnerable little children in the previous 14 verses is why we get these instructions right here. This is not some rigorous list of hardcore rules meant to be controlling and demanding or cult-like. These rules are here for our good. They're here to give us an agreed-upon template that none of us had to write for ourselves, but that were handed down by God in the flesh, the initiator of the entire proposition. These things were handed down by him, so we can just agree on those and try to do it. There's a way out, and there's grace, and there's life, and there's a way forward in this stuff. And the fact that he left it for us indicates that he cares very much about us, these little children. I know this one felt different, and I knew Matthew 18 was going to take us to some of these places. Thank you for allowing me to process some of my own history and baggage with you on this. I hope it was fruitful for this passage to afford you the opportunity to do the same. And my hope for all of us is that something really redemptive comes out of the time we've spent thinking about this thing that Jesus taught. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.